Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program, and thanks so much for being here. I'm Marcia Eli. I come to you from the Center for Brooklyn History of the Brooklyn Public Library, and also BPL Presents, which is the library's arts and culture arm. Tonight, I am thrilled to welcome author James Gaines, whose latest book, which comes out on February 8th, is titled The Fifties, An Underground History. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what Publishers Weekly says. It says this revisionist history is packed with insights. It goes on to say that Gaines delivers a compassionate and insightful group portrait of singular men and women who spoke out on LGBTQ issues, women's rights, civil rights, and the environment in the 1950s, not the complacent era that we all maybe think it is. So tonight, James's conversation partner is writer Daniel Okrent. And before I introduce the two of them, I just have a few quick notes for you. First, while the book is not released for a few more weeks, this is kind of a sneak peek. You can pre-order it, and we will put a link in the chat to the website of a local Brooklyn bookstore, the community bookstore, so that you can do that if you so desire with just a couple of clicks. Second, like all of our talks, you have the option tonight to use closed captioning. That feature is at the bottom of your screen, live transcript. And finally, I want to invite you all to share your questions tonight for James. Type them throughout the program into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and Dan will take as many of them as he has time for towards the end of the program. So now let me say a word about each of our guests, and I will happily hand it off to them. James R. Gaines is the former managing editor of Time, Life, and People magazines, and the author of several books, including Wit's End, Days and Nights of the Algonquin Roundtable, Evening in the Palace of Reason, a study of Johann Sebastian Bach and the early Enlightenment, and For Liberty and Glory, Washington, Lafayette, and Their Revolutions. And Daniel Okrent's books include Great Fortune, The Epic of Rockefeller Center, which was a finalist for the 2004 Pulitzer Prize in History, Last Call, The Rise and Fall of Prohibition, and The Guarded Gate, Bigotry, Eugenics, and the Law That Kept Two Generations of Jews, Italians, and other Europeans out of America. He was also the first public editor of the New York Times. Welcome to you both. Thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to hear your conversation, and take it away.
Thank you very much, Marcia. I'm very happy to be here, and I want to thank the library and the bookstore for making this possible. And I want to say hello to my old friend, Jim. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Dan.
Jim and I met during the 1960s. We're very old. In Ann Arbor, Michigan, at a moment when people of our generation thought that we were changing the world. We didn't change the world that much, but we did take a lot of self-congratulatory moments to show how different we were. But what one learns from reading Jim's book, from reading the 50s, is that the 60s were the consequence of the 50s. As Marcia said when she introduced us, the complacent 50s were not complacent for those people who were fighting enormous battles that had great consequences in the 60s, and many of them still have consequences in a very positive sense today. Jim, why did you write this book?
Initially, it was because my kids came home from school one day and said, "Why is our time not as exciting as the 60s?" And I had to say, well, I didn't say that it was actually fraught. It wasn't all fun and games. They were talking about the music, I think, mostly. But then I started to think, I was looking for a subject after I finished the Washington Lafayette book. And I started to think, how was it that this black and white decade led to this polychromatic riot of the 60s? History just doesn't work that way. It doesn't work by decades, as you well know. So I started to think, why, how did the 60s emerge? And as I was reading, it came to me that it wasn't the decade I thought it was. I can't say it wasn't at all, but it was different and more complicated than I had known.
And that makes for a good book.
Yes, it does.
Could you maybe introduce where we're going by reading the last paragraph of the introduction, page
Yeah.
XX? Yeah.
There's a theory that change happens not by winning hearts and minds, but by changing the law, after which hearts and minds will follow. Among isolated people of the 50s, however, there's evidence of an earlier stage in the process of change. The moment when a singular man or woman sets out to confront rather than evade some intimately personal conflict, which inspires them and others to change the hearts and minds of those who make the laws. Though isolated by their personal histories, idiosyncrasies, flaws, and gifts, they have in common the courage, the vision, and a profoundly motivating need to fight for change in their time and the future. This book is about some of the best of them.
And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Many of the people that Jim writes about in this book, several of them are familiar names, and we'll talk about a few of them. But one of the huge contributions I think the book makes is it introduces us to people who were enormously influential players in our nation's history, and very few of us know who they were. And I thought we might start out, Jim, tell us a little bit about Harry Hay. Who was Harry Hay?
Harry Hay started the first sustained organization for gay rights in American history. And he did so at the worst possible time. It was just after World War II, a time when the United States, the Soviet Union, and Nazi Germany shared the view that homosexuals were criminals and potential security risks, and the church thought were wicked, and the medical profession called psychopaths. And it was at this moment that Harry Hay, who was then married with 2 daughters, decided, and a member of the Communist Party, by the way, which we'll come back to, decided that it was time to start a gay rights movement. And everybody told him he was crazy, and he did it anyway, because among other things, he was incredibly stubborn. And he did it. It was called the Mattachine Society. And it was sort of like an Alcoholics Anonymous group where you came and you talked about that issue, but it took him 3 or 4 years to even get someone to join him in that effort. And in that time, he lost his family.
What year are we in, Jim?
When he actually got to start the thing, it was 1951. When he thought about it, it was 1946, 47. And in the time between, he lost his family, he lost all his friends, except the gay men that he knew and were his friends outside the home. He lost his relationship with his daughters, although he tried to keep it up by paying the child support he was supposed to through his job at a weapons factory. This was in Los Angeles. And they lived in a neighborhood that was called the Swiss Alps because it was a gay scene. And it was a scene he had to keep himself away from, which was, he had terrible dreams as he moved towards starting this organization, about falling down mountainsides, pushing his children down mountainsides, hurting them and his wife. I can't imagine a worse conflict, but he managed to do it. And then as soon as he did it, at their first convention, he was voted out of power because of his communist connections. And by then it was 1953, and everybody was scared to death of McCarthy. And they had every right to be scared of McCarthy because, the combination of communism and homosexuality was really not pretty at the time. Everybody thought that they were spies. They were being fired by the hundreds from the State Department.
a couple of things jumped out at me reading about Hay and the environment. One, just as a fact that I had no idea, that when the American Army liberated the concentration camps in Eastern Europe, we did not set free the men who had pink triangles on their shoulders.
Correct.
They were just left there.
They were returned to Germany, whose courts had sentenced them to long prison terms, and they got no credit for time served in the concentration camp.
Incredible.
And we knew that when we handed them over.
And that's 1945?
1945, 46, yeah.
So
No,
moving forward,
1945.
yeah, moving forward a few years, a phrase that comes up in the discussion of the Mattachine Society is self-respect as a radical demand. Could you elaborate on that?
I think that says it all. I mean, can you imagine a time when self-respect would be considered a radical demand? I mean, it's infuriating, honestly. But at the time, that was the case.
That's effectively what, at that point, Hay and his associates were not advocating changes in laws or anything. They wanted self-respect. That was really the issue.
Self-respect, but they also wanted the gayola stuff to stop, where cops would demand payment from bars from gay bars, and also that they were generally oppressed. Everywhere they went, they were oppressed. They had to have sex in bathrooms, and so the police hung out in bathrooms. I mean, it was very a sorry sight.
So when Harry Hay is kicked out of the organization that he had labored and sweat for to found, that doesn't end things. Tell us about Frank Kameny.
Before I get to Kameny, I'll tell you where it went. It went to a guy who in San Francisco, who turned the organization inside out. He made psychologists part of their routine meetings, psychologists who told them they were sick and needed help. He actually told the FBI that he would help them find gay people in San Francisco. That didn't come out until a very recent book, but it was terrible. But then Frank Kameny in Washington, who had never joined the Mattachine Society, he had got his PhD in astronomy from Harvard and was about to start teaching at Georgetown when he went to San Francisco for an academic meeting, presented a paper there, but was caught in a bathroom having sex with someone else, and was arrested. And then he was outed to the civil service, where he then had been hired because he couldn't teach at Georgetown anymore. But they didn't know, the civil service did not know this happened until sometime later, when they called him in and said, "What happened in San Francisco?" And he refused to answer, but then he just told them it was none of their business, and they fired him. And then he, on a diet of 20 cents a day, I mean, an allowance of 20 cents a day because he had no money, he sold his car to get that, he began papering Washington with this story and complaining about the legal and moral insult that this represented, not only to him, but to other gay men who at the time were still being fired at a very fast rate, because now McCarthy was really in his high moment. So he graduated then to being perhaps the most successful advocate for sexual, the lack of, or the absence of sexual discrimination, and he, including an appeal to the Supreme Court on behalf of a guy named Bruce Scott, that was not successful. But actually the Chief Justice's clerk thought it would be, but he knew that the court would never take the case, and that's what happened. Frank Kameny kept fighting and fighting and fighting for years until finally he was able to go to the Obama White House, and the Obama White House repealed Clinton's "don't ask, don't tell" policy. I skipped over the fact that Frank Kameny was a decorated soldier in World War II, an 88 millimeter motor crewman, and was prouder of nothing than his infantryman, combat infantryman's badge, which he wore to that occasion. The stories
But that was in
people,
his case. That was after half a century of his battling for his cause.
yes.
Extraordinary. We've got a lot
the
of
Obama
other,
administration.
we have a lot of people to cover, but before we leave this subject, could I ask you to read the last paragraph on page 47?
Yeah, Frank Kameny, Harry Hay, and their known and unknown cohorts left the country a priceless legacy. They lifted the burden of shame from millions of people whom the medical profession called psychopaths, the church called wicked, and the state called felons. And they replaced that burden with every citizen's birthright, self-respect and the respect of others. No one in the early homophile movement got more recognition in their lifetimes than Harry Hay and Frank Kameny. But what deserves celebration as much as the victories they and their compatriots won is the model they left behind. The poet E.E. Cummings famously wrote, "To be nobody but yourself in a world which is doing its best day and night to make you everybody else means to fight the hardest battle which any human being can fight." That is what they did.
Thanks, Jim. The next section of the book is about the origins of American feminism in the 20th century, or I guess American feminism post the voting amendment, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. The key figure in this chapter, there are many women in this chapter who are really kind of thrilling figures, but the one who struck me was Pauli Murray. Tell us about Pauli Murray, if you would.
Thanks to a new movie, she's finally getting some credit for all she did. But she began life, her mother died when she was 3, and she was sent to live with her grandparents. One of them fought for the Union in the Civil War, and the other one was the child of a Black slave and a white, she was the child of a Black slave, but she was also the mistress, as it were, but I don't think she was. She was the rape victim of her owner's son. So she grew up with people on both sides of the South, and she was, as a result of their skin color, of what she called in-between race, which was especially a problem in school when she was young, because she was made fun of for that reason. And then as she became a teenager, she thought she was misidentified as a girl. She felt she was a man. And she kept writing to doctors saying, "Please help. I know there's been a mistake." So she was in between both racial and gender. So that was her struggle, and that was her weapon against the world as she found it later.
And as she helps form it, to me, that part of the story really begins when she's in law school at Howard University.
Right.
Can you tell us about
Yeah,
that?
she was well educated. She went to her background was middle class. Her family were nurses and professional people and academics. So she was going around the country trying to save a sharecropper named Odell Waller from the noose, and I mean a legal noose. He had been convicted of murder wrongly, but of course convicted in minutes by a white jury. At one stop, she gave her spiel in front of Thurgood Marshall and Leon Ransom, who was then the dean of Howard Law School, and was given, as a result, a full tuition scholarship to Howard. She was the only girl, only woman in her class of all Black men, because Howard is a Black university. And she found herself laughed at behind her back. She was not called in class as much as the other guys, as the other people. And she was, at the first instance, aware of what she came to call Jane Crow. It was the combination of sexual discrimination, gender discrimination, and racial discrimination. Her final law school paper was about how the equal protection argument of the Constitution could prevail over Plessy versus Ferguson, the separate but equal decision of the 19th century. Her classmates laughed at her, but she prevailed and wrote that thesis. Her professor, Spottiswoode Robinson, bet her $25 $10 that it wouldn't be, that Plessy wouldn't be overturned for the next 25 years. In fact, it was overturned by Thurgood Marshall in the well-known Brown decision, which he won in part by reading her thesis, which Spottiswoode Robinson brought him because he realized he was really going for it. But she didn't address gender discrimination until years later, when she wrote a paper called Jane Crow. And that was the argument that Ruth Bader Ginsburg used when she was still an attorney to argue, to write the brief that won the Supreme Court's decision to declare sexual discrimination to be unconstitutional. That was a huge breakthrough. And it was because of Pauli Murray, and Ginsburg acknowledged that by putting her name on the brief.
No, her role as a figure in American legal history is enormous.
Yes.
But we know Ginsburg and we know Marshall. We don't know her.
Exactly.
And we begin to see, or I begin to see reasons, not reasons why, but I begin to see the nature of this discrimination very vividly around the time of the March on Washington, in 1962. By this point, she's a well-known figure, certainly within the civil rights legal community. And the March on Washington, which we all know about, is about to take place. And she's not very pleased with the way it's proceeding. So she writes to A. Philip Randolph, who was one of the organizers, the labor leader who was one of the organizers of the march. Could you read what she said to him? Page 74.
74. Yes. And by the way, A. Philip Randolph and his March on Washington movement from the 1940s hired her. He was her first real employer. And this is what she said to him when Rosa Parks, Daisy Bates, all the Septima Clark, all of the prominent women of the civil rights movement were giving seconds on the podium at the March on Washington. 74, I'm not there, sorry. The time has come to say to you quite candidly, Mr. Randolph, that tokenism is as offensive when applied to women as when applied to Negroes. That's the word she always used. And that I have not devoted the greater part of my adult life to the implementation of human rights to now condone any policy which is not inclusive.
Were there any consequences?
No.
going forward?
In fact, the day before the march, he spoke at the National Press Club, which then consigned women to the balcony. I mean, really, it was, it shows you just how complex and really diseased the relationship was between the Black civil rights movement and the women's rights movement.
But then 3 years after the March on Washington, she plays a key role in a very important moment in American feminist history.
She does. She introduced, she was on the President's Commission on Civil Rights, and specifically on the issue of feminism, especially the Equal Rights Amendment. And she was well, I forget exactly what happened, but Betty Friedan reached out to her. I know it was a piece in the New York Times when she basically threatened action in the behalf of feminism or women's rights. And Betty Friedan reached out and talked to her, and Pauli Murray described to her what she thought of as an NAACP for women. And Betty Friedan picked up that mantle and went with it. Pauli Murray helped her, introduced her to her network at the President's Commission, and the rest is history, except that a couple of years later, Pauli Murray quit NOW, the National Organization of Women, which she helped to start, because of a lack of diversity. It was just not the organization she wished to help. She was looking beyond that to a movement of multiple discriminations against Indigenous people, against people from other countries, against, a class, race, and gender.
This is half a century.
She was not willing to, sorry?
Half a century ago.
Half a century ago, exactly. So she was a pioneer of what's now been called intersectional feminism.
Right. Next subject, third section of the book is about the civil rights movement. Obviously, an enormous moment in American history. I wonder if you might begin with a little bit of backstory on this, the history of Black men and their military service in this country.
Yeah, this is a chapter somewhat different because it tries to rectify the imbalance between, well, it tries to minimize the effect that men coming home from the war had on the civil rights movement and how important armed defense was to the nonviolent movement. When Medgar Evers, for example, we know a lot about Medgar Evers, but not everything. When he came home from service, but he served from D-Day to the Battle of the Bulge. When he came home, he was on his way home on the back of a bus in uniform with his discharge papers and full of medals. And when the bus stopped for people to eat lunch, he was left on the bus. I can't even imagine.
This is in the 1940s.
Yes,
or early
this
50s.
is 1940s.
Yeah.
Late 45, 46. It was 46. And that year was an election year, midterm election year. And Medgar Evers and his brother Charles decided they were going to vote, which no one had ever done in their county. And they went, their parents were told, don't let this happen because you're not going to like what happens to them. The parents told them what this white visitor had said, but they did not tell them not to go to the polling place, and they did, where they were turned back by guns and the threat of violence. And they turned back and they got their own guns and walked back toward the polling place, and they were about by more guns and decided, wait, we don't really want to get killed. So they walked home. They were not able to vote in 1946. And I mean, it's striking to me that we're still talking about voting rights. There's going to be a debate in the Senate tonight. Maybe it's going on already about voting rights. How could this be? It's disgusting.
There's a historical precedent relating to this. I wonder about Black soldiers returning from World War I. There's a quote that I could read the quote, or do you want to read the quote?
No, either way.
Okay, let me read this. This is a six-year-old girl remembering when the last Black veterans of World War I came home to Alabama, and she never forgot sitting up nights with her grandfather, who kept a shotgun on his lap, waiting for the Klan. She remembered him saying, "I don't know how long I would last if they came breaking in here, but I'm getting the first one who comes through the door." She stayed up with him, she remembered, because I wanted to see it. I wanted to see him shoot that gun. Who was that 6-year-old?
Rosa Parks. She already had the fire in the belly, as we say. I think that, Frederick Douglass urged Black men to join the Civil War on the Union side, because he was convinced that if they did, their standing in the country would be as regular citizens. And W.E.B. Du Bois said the same thing in World War I. And neither of them got any credit. In fact, what happened was when they came home in uniform, they were met by white terrorists who said, "Wear that uniform again and you will die." And that happened to one of the people that I write about.
You want to talk about Isaac Woodard at this point?
Indeed, let's do. Isaac Woodard was he went in as a private, came home as a tech sergeant. He was working with an all-Black unit in the Pacific Theater. And when he came home, he was on a bus going home to Winnsboro, North Carolina, where his wife was waiting for him. And when they made a stop, he had to go to the bathroom. And so he told the driver, "I need to go to the bathroom." And the driver said no. And he said, "No, goddamn it." And Isaac Woodard said, "Talk to me like I'm a man, just like you," which I think before the war, he would never have said that. And so the driver, without letting him know, went to a phone, called ahead to Batesburg, and told the police there was somebody on his bus who was making trouble. Got to Batesburg, where he was met by the entire police force of Batesburg, which was 2 guys, the chief of police and a deputy. The chief of police, the driver told him to get out and talk to the chief of police. He did. And before he could get a word out, the chief of police beat him in the head with a special baton that was, rigged for real impact. It had a spring-loaded.
He's in uniform, right?
He's in uniform. And he managed to get the baton away from the guy and started fighting. And the deputy came around and put his gun on Woodard and told him he would shoot him if he didn't stop. So he didn't stop. And the chief of police kept beating him. At one point, they could tell later that he had ground his baton into Woodard's eyes, which indicates that Woodard had made the mistake of looking directly at him. Woodard was blind for the rest of his life. What can I say? And Truman took his case up. He was talked to by the NAACP, and Truman was a real hero when it came to civil rights. He's rarely given credit for it, but he was the first presidential candidate ever to campaign in Harlem. Truman said to his attorney general, "You got to look into this, and if necessary, and if right, bring charges against this chief of police." That was just unheard of in the South in 1946.
And was this around the same time that Truman integrated the armed forces?
Oh God, no. Well, I mean, it was the first time, Yeah, that was about 1950.
Oh.
But yeah, he was the first to try. It didn't really happen then, but
Yeah,
he was the first to make it a policy. Anyway, Woodard was blind for the rest of his life and never knew that Truman had come in for him, that in fact the trial took place and the judge in the trial was absolutely on Woodard's side, and actually set a bunch of precedents for civil rights law in the time going forward, was alienated from his town, and Woodard never knew about any of this.
And this judge, who was in Charleston,
Right.
had never particularly shown any interest in civil rights issues, defending the rights of Black people, but he was so horrified by this. Needless to say, I guess, for that period, the jury acquitted the police chief, correct?
Of course, in minutes.
Yeah.
In fact, he took a walk around town so that they couldn't acquit him too fast. And his wife was in the courtroom and burst into tears. And Woodard never forgot it.
Yeah, great. An incredible story. The last section of the book is about ecology, a word that probably didn't even exist back then. But
No, it did actually.
You know, my fault. We know a lot about Rachel Carson, who is a key figure in this chapter. The great writer and naturalist who moved from studying the seashore to studying what was happening to our birds, and wrote Silent Spring, which I think is probably maybe the one that comes closest to it, is Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed, the book that changes the world's view of something, in this case, DDT. But there's a second character that you pair her with, even though they never met, and that's Norbert Wiener. As he was called in a newspaper headline when he was 12 years old, the most remarkable boy in the world. I think page 149.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got it?
Yeah. Shall I read some or?
Yeah, I think read that from the bottom of page 149.
Yeah. Norbert Wiener was 12 years old when Rachel Carson was born, but he was the most unlikely 12-year-old. While others his age were in 5th or 6th grade, he was entering his freshman year at Tufts University. In 1906, that was the article in the World calling him the most remarkable boy in the world. And it's hard to imagine anyone who better fit that title. He told the World reporter he had learned much more from reading Ernest Haeckel's The Riddle of the Universe in German than Homer in Greek, since Homer was just telling stories. Yes, he said, of course, he loved to have fun. Swimming is my forte, he said, but I like studying too. When I have participated in the boys' games, I turn to my Huxley or my Spencer. Suggestions from them which led my mind to greater things.
So these greater things, Wiener ends up at MIT, extremely eccentric character, widely acknowledged as a genius, peculiar life. It's actually, I wish we had more time to read about some of Norbert Wiener's peculiarities because they are really something. But he's talking as a 12-year-old about the greater things you want. What were the greater things? Where did Norbert Wiener go with his life, with that brilliance?
He got his doctorate and his postdoctorate work at various esteemed universities. His postdoc was with Bertrand Russell and John Dewey. He was just a genius at not only mathematics, but the logic of mathematics. And it was a time when computers were being developed, at a time when the computer was a person with a slide rule and a pencil. Literally, that was what they were called. He was put into the war effort in 1940-41 in order to deal with the Luftwaffe, which was reigning terror over Britain at the time, and which was much higher and faster than anybody knew before the war started. He was famous for work in Brownian motion, which I won't go into, but he was really interested in the fact, and he came to this through his wartime work, that you could put people and mechanical things, including electrical mechanical things, in a single task. So he conceived of anti-aircraft as the combination of people on the ground, the gunner, et cetera, and a circle of causality between the airplane in the sky, the speed of the airplane, the maneuvers of the airplane, the ability of the pilot to do evasive maneuvers, and a round circle of information, which was, there was no enemy in this process. It was just a circle of information, which helped the guy on the ground bring that guy down.
But he changes. I'm going to push you a little bit because I want to leave room for questions.
Okay.
But his relationship to the military changes radically, and this begins to be the place where he and Carson, though they never met, are kind of coming together. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the military was responsible for all kinds of horrible. The military and corporate America were responsible for some very serious implications on the environment. I mean, it was a time when science was accomplishing incredible things. But among those incredible things was the atomic bomb, napalm, Zyklon B, which Hitler used in the concentration camps, as well as synthetic fertilizers, synthetics of all sorts, which poisoned the atmosphere, poisoned the ground that farmers were to work on. It was a time when actually during the war, Los Angeles thought it had had a chemical attack because the fumes from newly muscular cars were choking people. And after that, then the military actually started experimenting on the American public with like dropping radioactive materials to find out, what dose actually caused a problem. They experimented on all kinds of people in hospitals, over schools, over domestic, over suburbs. It was extremely irresponsible behavior, and we still don't know the extent of it, although a lot of it has come out in the Clinton administration. Actually,
where does Weiner come in?
Weiner, when the war was over and he saw some of this stuff happening in the environment, but also the militarization of American society and American science, he refused to have anything to do with military science. And at MIT, which was almost completely subsidized, at least the Rad Lab was almost completely subsidized by military, that was an incredible position to take. And he was thought to be, crazy for taking it. Everybody thought he was just being Norbert. But in fact, he never worked for the military and military science again. And he wrote a book after he wrote a book called Cybernetics, which was impossible to understand for most people. He wrote a book called The Human Use of Human Beings, which was incredibly radical for its time. It talked about the necessity of treating labor fairly at a time when the Great Strike Wave of 1946, 1947 had made basically workers into communists.
So Weiner, by taking this very strong and public position against the military misbehavior in domestic life, the parallel, if I may read something from your book, I think you very eloquently stated what's similar between what he's doing and what Rachel Carson in her campaign against DDT and other poisons in the environment, what is she doing? And you write, by confronting the effects of science practiced mainly in the pursuit of power and profit, and by calling for scientific innovations to be accessible and understood by politicians, policymakers, and the general public before they were deployed, Carson and Weiner advanced a compelling argument, namely that nature was neither a thing apart from humankind, nor any longer even wholly natural, since its anointed masters were ever more assertively rearranging the earth. As evidence of the dangers inherent in that mastery, they shined a very bright light on the masters at work and changed our lives, I think, in many ways.
I agree.
We want to go to questions. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. But I think before we do that, what better way to end the discussion, the formal discussion of a book, Jim, than by your reading, if you would, the last paragraph of the epilogue on page 205.
Okay. Going back to the way you started the conversation, my generation had our
That's the idea.
victories too. What?
That's the idea.
Yeah. My generation had our victories too, but looking back, I can't help feeling that people like those in this book were the more authentic rebels, in part because they didn't think of themselves that way. In a decade and a nation perhaps readier with opprobrium than ever before, they defied the most powerful forces and conventions of their time just to be the people they were in the country it had always promised to be. Thanks to that, they lit a path for the rest of us to a somewhat less imperfect union, which is about the best thing any citizen can do.
A great way to end the book and the formal part of the evening. And now I'd like to turn to questions from everybody who's listening. If you have something, as I said, please put it in the Q&A. Here's a question about Polly Murray. Did she ever resolve her gender confusion?
I'm not sure. She had, because of her feeling about who she was, the male part of herself, she was disappointed in love many times because she was only attracted to heterosexual women. But she did get over it to the extent that she was a hero. I mean, how much more can you do with that conflict than what she did? And in fact, at the end of her life, she went to seminary because they had never had altar girls in the church. So she went to Episcopal seminary and became a priest, knowing she would have only 3 years before mandatory retirement when she was done. I mean, that speaks wonders. But she also had a companion at the end of her life whom she loved and who loved her. So to that extent, yes, she did overcome her conflict.
Thank you. Here's a question all the way from Providence, Rhode Island, from someone named Allison Pell. She asks, obviously, this is a different take on this time and various individuals' impact on change. What most of all should we take away from the book? And what does this teach us about the way history is written?
I think more than anything, it's about extraordinary people whose stubbornness and conflict teaches them every day how to make change without their taking any lessons from anyone. It's just because they wanted to be who they were and have the rights that they were due, including self-respect. I think it's about that simple.
Well, isn't that just a kind of a variation on what's historically been called the great man theory of history, that individuals in that theory, obviously they're leaders of nations and such, but
right, exactly.
You're kind of saying the same thing, that you don't have to be the leader of a nation to be able to make this change if you are the right person at the right moment, or at least to get the change happening.
I would argue something else. I would argue that that a president of the United States or a senator, as Joe Manchin and Sinema are not, is the one who conveys to the president of the United States or the Senate the injustice of the position they've been given. And I think, they gather other people around them, and movements start from what they've done. And I think ultimately those people in power don't come up with these ideas themselves.
Here's a question from Jane. With the dumbing down of sensible discussions with the advent of social media, what hope is there for genuine movements for meaningful social political change?
Well, just as it's difficult not to be disgusted by the lack of progress in civil rights, you can't ignore the progress we've made in gay rights, in feminism, and certainly ecology. We haven't won all those battles, but we're further ahead than we were then. And progress, as Martin Luther King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. It is very long sometimes.
So these people are here among us now, and they're in the process of doing the things that these unknown figures that you've mostly unknown figures from American, fairly recent American history, they could move the world.
Yeah, yep, that's
Well,
the case.
That's a very positive view, look on it. Can you, here's an anonymous questioner says, do you think there are people, well, that's the same thing I just asked. Let me try this one. Well, I think we know the answer to this, but Gregory asks, David Halberstam did a fairly comprehensive look at the 50s. Why did you decide to dig deeper into that fascinating decade? Another way of asking that, what the key way is your book different from David Halberstam's book, The 50s?
His book on the 50s was very good, for one thing, but also it covered in depth the things we know about the 50s in shallow. And it didn't deal really with the people. Well, it did deal, but fleetingly, over the social issues that this book addresses.
I don't have any other questions there now. If you've got them, come with them. But because I think it's always good in any discussion of serious issues to take a moment for some humor, with Jim's permission, I'd like to read a little bit more about Norbert Wiener. May I, Jim?
Please, yes.
Okay, so this is Wiener after he's established as a very well-known figure, as a genius. He's at MIT. Jim writes that he was fluent in a dozen languages and socially inept in all of them. As a colleague put it, a foreigner wherever he was. He got lost easily on his frequent meanderings through the MIT labs, where he worked for 45 years. Some labs posted lookouts to warn of his approach, because Wiener was known to cut into ongoing conversations abruptly and wholly out of context. While reading a book or lost in thought, he would walk the halls with one finger tracing the wall. When he reached the open door of a classroom or laboratory, he was known to follow his finger inside and around its walls back to the hallway. When he stopped to have a conversation, he sometimes forgot which way he had been walking. Once, he asked whether he had been walking toward the lunchroom or away from it, so he would know if he had had lunch or not. I just think that that's a nice.
My favorite is that he swam on his back so he could smoke a cigar while he was swimming.
Well, the reason why I didn't cite that is my father did the same thing. And it was really.
Did he really?
Well, he did it with a cigarette, and only, you know, he loved the backstroke. Anyway, we are moving a little bit far from the topic.
Yes.
I want to thank you, Jim. We are running out of time, and thank the library, and thank the community bookstore, and thank all of you who have dialed in tonight to listen to this, or those who will be watching it shortly on the recorded version, which will be posted tomorrow. So with that, I'm going to say again, thanks, Jim, and turn it back over to Marcia.
Yes, and I'm going to add my thanks to you, Jim, and Dan, to you for really orchestrating such a masterful conversation about the book, and all of the readings that we wove in really helped a lot. You know, it's so important to tell the stories of individuals and elevate them, and the power that they have to actually affect change, because that inspires us all. I mean, there were some pretty shocking and awful things that folks were battling against that you describe. Anyway, I want to thank everybody who's come for being here, and tell you that the program was recorded and will be on our YouTube page tomorrow. And just tell you a little bit about what's coming down the pike later this month and in early February. We will have another program about a book. It's called The Last Slave Ship, with Ben Raines, who discovered the Clotilda, which is the last known slave ship that brought enslaved people here from Africa illegally. He discovered that ship in the bayou of Alabama, and he will be talking about not only his experience, he's a journalist, but what it means for all of us, and what happened to the people who were on that ship. And then later in February, early February, Imani Perry will be here to talk about South to America. So all of which is to say that I hope that I see that we have the upcoming programs link in the chat, and I hope that everyone, explores that and joins us for more programs later this month into February and down into the spring. We're so grateful to both of you and Jim for this fantastic book that, it doesn't get more pure than to talk about people and their lives and how it has affected and changed things. And thank you for digging them up. And thanks to all of you for being here tonight. So on that note, I hope everyone has a wonderful evening and a good night. Thank you.
Good night. Bye-bye.